broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, More Than Honey, Beekeeping, Sustainability, and How It Influences Agriculture and Food Supplies. My name is Julia Froik. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Caitlin Leahy, project manager for PARM, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Pete Berthelsen, Partnership Director for the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and President of Conservation Blueprint, LLC. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please remember to submit questions for Pete on the GoToWebinar panel during his presentation. I will moderate the questions for approximately 10 minutes after the presentation. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and a link to the webinar evaluation. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org and YouTube. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for integrated pest management and 0.5 for sustainability. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. If you watch the webinar recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email your CCA number to julia@partnershipfarm.org to ensure your credits are submitted. Please make a big note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 4 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Julia, and thank you all for joining us today. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management, or PARM, is an effort of our nonprofit IPM Institute of North America, along with many other projects in agriculture and communities, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. We're all aware of the water quality challenges we face, from the record-breaking algal blooms in the Western Lake Erie Basin and in many other areas in the U.S., to the expansive hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We also know agriculture is a major contributor to these issues based on water quality monitoring and published research. The graph on the top left shows the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's annual data on algal bloom severity in the Western Lake Erie Basin since 2002. On average, blooms are becoming more severe, and the size of the hypoxic zone is still much larger than the Hypoxia Task Force's goal of 5,000 square kilometers, making it increasingly important for the ag industry to step up and showcase their positive efforts to retain nutrients on fields. PARM addresses these water quality issues by working with agricultural retailers to promote, track, and report on profitable products and services that keep inputs on cropland. Through retail sales, or in other words, customer adoption, we can estimate nutrient loss reductions based on peer review studies. These estimates are variable due to factors like slope, soil type, and weather, but give our participants the best idea of where they can likely make a difference. We track these sales through annual surveys and provide both aggregate, public reports, and confidential individual nutrient stewardship reports to participating locations. The 90 ag retailer locations we partner with in the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi River Basin are working hard to improve water quality. Our survey results show average increases in several products and services, including variable rate application and cover crops. Our participants represent over 5.3 million acres in both basins, giving us ample data on current adoption rates, profitability of products and services, and barriers to adoption. By analyzing our survey results, we can offer catered educational tools to individual locations and incentive programs to get retail customers to try new practices. You can receive these benefits by becoming a valued PARM member. Visit our website, partnershipfarm.org, for more information. With that, I'd like to turn the mic back to Julia.
Thank you, Caitlin. As Caitlin mentioned, we provide free resources for ag retailers, grower clients, and consultants. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards in the lower left corner can also be ordered for free on our website. To find out more about our incentive programs, click the menu under our Ag Retailer tab on the PARM website. Our next webinar in our regular PARM series will air in late November, topic and date to be determined. Our next webinar in our Great Lakes Conservation Connect series will air in early December. Look for announcements in your email, on Facebook, and Twitter. And remember, we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. And now we'll get the presentation started with Pete Berthelsen, Partnership Director for the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and President of Conservation Blueprint, LLC.
All right, thank you, Julia. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with folks today. This is a subject that I'm really interested in as I've become more engaged and involved with the beekeeping world and commercial beekeeping. There's a lot of things about that world that I find that really not that many people, including myself, really knew or understood. So I'm interested in talking about this subject today. And I'll start out by giving just a real quick introduction to myself. My name's Pete Berthelsen. I'm a wildlife biologist. I reside in central Nebraska in an area in a region of the country that's called the Luss Hills, which is rolling topography that's divided almost evenly between rangeland and crop ground. This is a little aerial view of a portion of the farm that I have. It is divided evenly between row crops, irrigated, and dry land, and then rangeland. I am a hobbyist beekeeper that has been keeping bees for several years now, but really the thing that I think best describes me is I'm a wildlife biologist that has spent my career trying to get high quality, highly diverse habitat onto the landscape. So with that, let's hop into today's presentation. And today's audience, when we looked at the people that registered for today, it's a very, very diverse audience, but it is comprised primarily of crop consultants, beekeepers, egg producers, and then consultant agronomists, along with lots of other people from across the whole country. So that's kind of the primary audience that this presentation was created for. And in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about three kind of key points. One, I want to provide a little bit of a different perspective about the beekeeping industry and how dramatically in the last couple of decades that industry has changed, how honeybees and beekeeping works hand in glove with agriculture, and then some different ways in which we can support honeybee health. Before we go too far into this, just one slide to talk about the most basic aspect of what is pollination. And pollination, or a pollinator, is really any kind of a critter that gets the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant so that that plant can reproduce and bear fruit. And when we talk about pollinators, We very, very often think about insects because they are so highly efficient at doing this, but a pollinator, a critter that gets the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant, really includes a hugely wide range of species that can range from birds and bats and butterflies and all kinds of animals. But today we're going to talk and focus our efforts talking about honeybees. Almost any kind of a pollinator that we're going to talk about, especially in the insect world, is currently experiencing population declines. And that's a great concern, whether we're talking about decreased monarch butterfly populations and their current consideration for listing as an endangered species, or we're going to talk about some of the aspects that impact the beekeeping world. It's pretty important stuff. So I think that if you were to talk to any beekeeper, you would pretty consistently come up with a list of 5 things that are influencing the health of their honeybees. And those 5 things are listed here. And if you look at those 5 and kind of start to think about them, weather is something that we don't have an awful lot of control over that. If you look at agriculture throughout the Midwest and the Great Plains this year in 2019, obviously we don't have a lot of ability to control weather because we have probably the highest number of prevent plant acres that maybe we've ever had in the history of the organization. When you look at pesticides and pathogens and parasites, varroa and different diseases, we're putting a lot of work into those, but yet we don't seem to be making a lot of headway. And pesticides have an influence as well on pollinator health, but those are always going to be used in agriculture. Today's presentation really isn't going to talk about those 4 factors: weather, parasites, disease, pesticides. They can all be very important, and I don't want to minimize the role that they have, but for the most part, today's presentation is going to talk about how changes in habitat, or if you're a beekeeper, you probably call it forage, have had a significant impact on that industry. Here's a graph that shows annual honeybee colony loss over about the last 13 years. And one of the things that this graph shows us is that the number of losses that beekeepers have for annual honeybee colony losses has significantly increased over the last 10 to 20 years. And if you look at the National Pollinator Plan, the goal is to have annual losses at no greater than 15%. That's the level at which beekeeping can remain sustainable. And you can see by looking at this graph that for quite some time, over a decade now, we've been significantly above that line. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how these kinds of changes have significantly impacted the beekeeping world. So the first thing that we want to do is, I think we want to define what a beekeeper is. And they kind of fit into 3 categories. A person like myself is called a hobbyist. I have 6 hives, and anybody that has 50 hives or less is called a hobbyist. A sideliner is somebody that has between 50 and 400 hives. This is something that they spend a lot of time on. They probably are deriving a significant amount of income, but this isn't their only business or thing that they're doing to generate an income. A commercial beekeeper is somebody that has greater than 400 hives and could be up to 10, 20, 30,000 hives. The the very upper limit of the maximum number of hives that really would be able to be handled. So those are the three categories that beekeepers are typically divided into. A commercial beekeeper, I'm going to use them as some examples today. So when we think about commercial beekeepers, this is a large business that uses beekeeping as its foundation. There's probably about 1,000 of them in the U.S. Almost every one of them is multi-generational. This business, this family has been in beekeeping for 3, 4, and 5 generations. And it's tied closely to agriculture. And if you think about what I've just described about how it's multi-generational and things like that, beekeeping has grown and really followed and tracked agriculture. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but the multi-generational aspect of commercial beekeeping really is pretty closely associated with agriculture as well. It's both of them, agriculture and commercial beekeeping, are a business that would be very hard to start fresh without some kind of family history in it and support that way. So beekeeping is an industry that has changed very substantially, especially over the last 20 years. And this slide that I'm showing you right here might be the wordiest slide that I've ever given in any presentation. I typically don't use lots of words, but this statement from a commercial beekeeper I thought so encapsulated what's going on in the beekeeping industry that I wanted to put it up there. It's pretty dramatically changed from something that was really simple and straightforward to something that is a very complicated business with minimal risk protection, and it has had a significant impact on the sustainability of beekeeping as an industry. And I'm going to provide a little more background to some of those things as well. If you go back in time in beekeeping, as I mentioned, was really very, very closely tied, hand in glove with agriculture. If you go back 30, 50, 60 years ago, almost every farm probably had a couple of beehives. But just as agriculture has specialized from being a smaller farm that had a large diversity of crops on it, small grains, large grains, hay, and that sort of thing, cattle, hogs, chickens. Just as agriculture has gotten larger and more specialized, so has beekeeping. So that's another example of its close relationship to beekeeping. And as you think about beekeeping today, you probably think, as I did, that beekeeping was about keeping bees, they generated honey, and at the end of the year, you left enough honey in the hive for the bees to make it through the winter and be healthy and thrive, and you took the excess honey away and you sold it, and that was your business model. And that used to be the beekeeping business model, but it's had to dramatically change. And I'll talk about those a little bit. Here's a couple of things to think about related to honey and beekeeping in the U.S. So in the last decade, the amount of honey that we produce in the United States has decreased by 25%. We produce, as a nation, about 150 million pounds a year. And just to put that in perspective of whether 150 million pounds is good or bad, think about this. As a nation, we consume 600 million pounds every single year. That means that 75% of the honey that we consume as a nation is coming from somewhere else. South America, Southeast Asia, and other points of the world are the common places where that 75% comes from. And then let your mind wander about what some of those parts of the world look like and the environmental constraints that are on how things are managed in those parts of the world. So I think that's an important point for everybody to understand, that 75% of the honey that we consume as a nation is coming from somewhere else. Here's a picture of a feral honeybee colony. This is a hole in a tree where the tree has a hollow spot inside. Obviously, there used to be a limb on there that broke off or was cut off, and there's a hole in there, and honeybees are using it. Many years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when some of us were children, probably was not very uncommon at all to see feral beehives, wild beehives, that took up residence in an old abandoned home or in a tree like this. Today, feral honeybee colonies are just about non-existent for some of the same reasons that are impacting our domesticated honeybees. And as those populations of native bees and feral bees declined, beekeepers were asked to help fill the void for pollination services in crops. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. If you look at the last 40 years in the beekeeping world, the beekeeping world has changed from a business model where 100% of the business model was about raising honey, taking the excess honey from honeybees and selling it. That's changed. And if you look at this table here, in the last 40 years, the business model for a commercial beekeeper has really turned almost upside down, where now the most important part of their income is coming from what we call pollination services. Bringing your bees to an agricultural crop that requires honeybees to be pollinated. And remember that one of the reasons, there's many reasons, but one of the key reasons why this is now needed, and it wasn't in the past, was because of decreasing honeybee populations, decreasing native bee populations, and the decrease in the feral honeybee population. So pollination services, this map of the country kind of shows some of the migratory routes that beekeepers travel to bring their honeybees to different crops to be pollinated. And if you think about it, and you look at some of the distances that are traveled on there, that is a very significant change in the beekeeping world that 40 years ago did not occur. 40 years ago, a beekeeper, a local beekeeper, probably would have brought his bees to an apple orchard or blueberries or California almonds or something like that. But it was a local beekeeper that was moving their bees a very short distance to provide those services. And maybe there wasn't even any incentive or a payment that went to the beekeeper. It was just good forage. The beekeepers brought their bees there. They helped the apple company produce more apples in their orchard, and everything worked very well, and things got along nicely. That has changed with the increased need for pollination services. And when honeybee colonies are loaded onto a truck and moved hundreds or thousands of miles to a new location, that produces a lot of stress on those honeybees. Just as an example, in a little bit, I'm going to talk about the California almond industry. When a load of bees, like what you see here, is trucked from an area of the Midwest or Great Plains to California, they have to arrive in California before there are floral resources available for the bees to feed on. But yet those bees need to be active and up and running and able to perform the pollination services that happen in February and March. So that means that not only do you have the stress of hauling bees to California, but then you have to do things like you have to provide supplemental feed for those bees. You have to feed them the nutrition, the forage, the food that they need because it's not available on the landscape. But yet the bees still have to be there to provide the pollination services that are coming up. That is a fundamental, dramatic change to how that industry and how that business model works. So when you have to haul bees to a location like California, you have to feed them, you have to have staff that is there to move them, to care for the bees, things change. So the business model for a commercial beekeeper today is that it costs about $325 per year per hive to keep that hive alive and functioning. So think about that, and think about the business model compared to the beekeeper 40 years ago that had bees, they were healthy and happy, and my business model was I just took the excess honey from them. And that $325 per hive per year cost can really kind of be broken down into 5 major areas. And these are in order of their expense to the business model: labor, overhead, diesel and transportation, the supplemental feeding, and then replacement of queen bees in that hive on an annual basis. Many of these are expenses that either in the old beekeeping business model would not have been present or would have been significantly reduced from the model where beekeepers are providing pollination services across the country. So here's some of the changes that in this model have happened to the hive. And every one of these is negative. There are reduced number of bees in a hive, more pests and diseases, reduced hive vigor, and then more hives dying, more hive mortality on an annual basis. These are all negatives, negative, negative, negative. The changes for beekeepers in the last 20, 30, 40 years have also been negative. They have much, much higher input costs to keep those bees alive. They're producing a decreased amount of honey, which we'll talk about later. The hive mortality rates have significantly increased, and there's simply fewer hives to go around to provide the pollination service needs. That's created an industry that is really struggling with sustainability. So think about if you have a role in agriculture. Think about a business model that you would have in agriculture in which you might have between 35 and 45% annual loss, and how you're going to make that and keep that business model sustainable. It's incredibly challenging. So there are a number of crops in the U.S. that are either 100% or very highly dependent upon honeybees to perform the pollination services to make their crop. Almonds, avocado, blueberries, broccoli, carrots, cauliflower, celery, and onions on this list are 100% dependent on honeybees. In the U.S., there's a total of 90 crops that either rely entirely or are highly dependent upon honeybees for their pollination to make a crop. So think about that and the role, the important critical role that honeybees and beekeepers play in our food supply and our pollination services. This next set of slides you might have seen before, but this is an example that was done to show what your food choices are with bees versus what your food choices in a grocery store would be without bees. And it's pretty dramatic. When you look at fruits, vegetables, and nuts, those are the primary crops that are really dependent upon honeybees and the pollination services that they provide. So now I want to tell a little story about something called California almonds. And I want to tell you a story about a crop that is grown in the Central Valley of California. And it's a crop that covers a significant number of acres. And I want to lay out a couple of factoids for you to consider about California almonds. The first is that it's a $5 billion crop. Just for the almonds is $5 billion. The trickle through the economy makes it a $21 billion economic output. Very significant factor in a crop. The next factor about an almond is that when you plant it, it takes 4 to 5 years for that almond tree to produce a nut that you'll harvest. This year there are 1.2 million acres of almonds that are producing nuts in California, and there's another 300,000 acres that are yet to produce nuts that will be coming online in the next couple of years. So in the next couple of years, we know that we'll have 1.5 million acres of almonds in California. A couple other factors to think about is that in this country, there's a total of 2.6 million commercial hives in the country. That includes hobbyists, sideliners, and commercial beekeepers. And remember that beekeepers and honeybee hives are experiencing 35 to 45% annual losses. And that means that when it comes to heading to California, out of that 2.6 million hives in the country, there's probably about 2 million that are available to go to California. Remember that my 6 hives that I have don't go to California. So not every hive in the country is really available to go to California for pollination services in almonds. In an almond orchard, if you want to have crop insurance on your crop, you need to have a minimum of 2 hives per acre to qualify for crop insurance. As an almond grower, probably optimal pollination is around 2.5 hives per acre. So start to do some of the math of the number of acres of acres of almonds, the number of hives available, and in 2019, almond pollination needed a minimum of 2.4 million hives. That is close to every single hive in the country needed. And in 2019, about 80% of the almond growers got fewer bees than they needed or they ordered for almond pollination. And this is a $5 billion crop that, in my opinion, is on the edge of the cliff and in danger of not having enough bees to be able to produce an incredibly valuable crop that is produced here in the United States. That's just one crop example looking at the California almond crop. So what's the solution? In my opinion, the solution is when we talk about how to have forage for honeybees. We often describe it as there are the 4 P's that affect honeybee health: poor nutrition, pests, pathogens, and pesticides. And I'm going to make the case that poor nutrition is the one thing that we can really do something about. So what's the solution? Think about this. In order to have a hive of bees that is healthy enough to go to California, you have to have a population in that hive of about 500,000 bees. And the only way that you get to that size of a bee population is with long days and warm weather. And that's what we get in the summer here in the Midwest and Great Plains, in the middle part of the country. And what happens to that hive in July and August? Last month, in July and August, what happens to the beehive in the month of July and August determines whether that hive is healthy enough, strong enough, and capable of being able to be used in pollination services next year. Let that sink in a little bit. What happens right now at this time of the year, in the month of July and August, determines the health of that honeybee colony, that hive, for next year. And it really comes down to the access to high quality habitat. And this is where I absolutely believe that pollinator habitat and agriculture can work hand in hand, like we see in this image right here. Whether or not the honeybee colony has access to great forage, pollinator habitat in July and August really determines what happens the next year. And access to high quality forage has the opportunity to help that hive address the impacts of disease, parasites, and pesticides, and weather. Lots of those things that we struggle so hard to control. If the hive has access to really high quality habitat, it can better fight off those other impacts. So that's why, if you take a look at an image like this, 2/3 of every honeybee colony in the United States travels to the northern Great Plains at least some point in time every year. They might winter in Texas or Florida or California or Kansas or wherever, but at some point in time in the year, they come to an area that looks like this because of the opportunity for access to high quality forage in July and August. Here's kind of an interesting note for you. Sometime next year, the state of North Dakota will have more registered honeybee hives than there are people in the state of North Dakota. Think about that. That's where folks are bringing their hives to be healthy. There's one other key for honeybees. If you take a look at an example of this project and you look at this field, this was a field and a seed mixture that was planted and designed for honeybees. One of the keys to providing great pollinator forage for honeybees is you have to have enough of a single plant that honeybees want that they can focus on that plant. And in this example, I'm going to highlight this plant that is called Phacelia. And honeybees and native bees absolutely go crazy for this plant. And in this field, there is an abundance of it. And that is really important because when a honeybee that is foraging out on the landscape finds an abundance of a high quality, highly nutritious plant, there's a lot of it there, that foraging bee goes back to the hive and does this thing called a waggle dance that tells the rest of the bees in the hive, this is where you need to go to forage. And this bee that's circled right here is performing that dance. And if you take a look at the bees that are around her, her sister bees, they're watching, they're learning, they're communicating back and forth about, sisters, here is where you need to go to get to the access for that high quality forage. So if a pollinator planting does not have enough of one plant species to make them go out and do this, then they're not going to be able to forage as much and as efficiently and capture those opportunities in July and August. Here's a couple other things to think about related to honeybees. A single hive can consume 200 pounds of honey and 40 pounds of pollen in a year. And to make that honey and to grab that pollen, it takes 2 million flowers to produce 1 pound of honey. The hive will consume 200 pounds of honey in a year, and it takes 2 million flowers to produce 1 pound of honey. This is a good example of where if the honeybees don't have access to high quality forage, we're going to have problems with their health going forward. All right, so to begin to address how we can provide that, I want to close out today's presentation by telling you about a unique nonprofit, a young nonprofit, only been around a couple of years, called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, that has come up with some very unique solutions for how to work with agriculture and private landowners and public land managers and corporations to provide key pollinator benefits. And I want to tell you a little bit about this program right now. There's 2 goals of the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. The first goal is we simply want to get great pollinator habitat out onto the landscape, the kind of pollinator habitat that you're seeing in these different images today. And then we want to demonstrate how that can be done in a cost-effective way that produces increased pollinator value so that we can work with other programs in agriculture going forward. So the first thing is that not all pollinator habitat is created equal. Just because a plant produces a flower doesn't mean that it's providing great pollinator value, either for honeybees, native bees, or butterflies. We want to very strategically think about how a pollinator seed mixture is designed. And towards that end, we've been designing seed mixtures that are made available through a habitat program called Seed a Legacy. And in the Seed a Legacy program, I'm excited about this program because it has a lot to offer. It provides free pollinator seed mixtures to projects located in a 12-state area of the Midwest and Great Plains. Projects that are at least 2 acres or larger. The project can be on private land, public land, or corporate land. And there's a really simple online application process that we have at the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund website, where you answer about 18 questions and attach a photo of your site. The project application is reviewed, and when that site is prepared and ready to be a successful planting, you receive free pollinator seed mixtures. And that pollinator habitat is established in a really unique manner, where on half of the project, we plant what's called a honeybee seed mixture that checks all of the boxes for what you heard today about honeybee needs. And on the other half of the project, we plant what we call a monarch butterfly seed mixture that provides the many native wildflower species that native bees and butterflies want and need. Many pollinator species use and benefit from both sides of the seed project, but because of how they're designed, they establish very differently. So we plant them into 2 different halves in the seed mixture. And one of the things that I'm excited to share with you today are some of the early results from 3 different research projects that have been looking at the pollinator value of the bee and butterfly habitat fund seed mixtures. And this study was conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey. And in this study, they compared the bee and butterfly habitat fund seed mixtures to USDA conservation programs, public lands, national wildlife refuges, roadside habitat, pastures, other grasslands. And the first graph that I'll show you is that the bee and butterfly habitat fund had lots and lots and lots of flowers in it, probably more than double the number of flowers in any other kind of habitat that was on the landscape. So that's good. That study found that the bee and butterfly habitat fund seed mixtures had 4 times the number of honeybee visits and value than any of the other habitat types that were out there. And the last graph I'll show you is that the bee and butterfly habitat fund seed mixtures provided 8 times the number of native bee visits and native bee pollinator value than any other habitat type that were out there, including an evaluation of other pollinator habitat programs. So if you think about it, 8 times the value, and our seed mixture designs come in at about 30% of the cost of some of the other conservation programs that were evaluated in this study. That's a pretty cool result. 8 times the value at 30% the cost. So I'm going to conclude here by showing you a photo of a bee and butterfly habitat fund project 14 months after it was planted. This is a project that was conducted with a private landowner in Minnesota, and it's really reflective of the kind of habitat projects that can really make a difference. We want to have the highest pollinator value that we can. We think that not all pollinator habitat is created equal. We think that we need to be thinking about native bees and butterflies and also benefiting commercial beekeeping. And we've come up with a way to put all of those objectives, cost effectiveness, how quickly it establishes, high pollinator value, better cost, working with commercial beekeeping, as well as native bees and butterflies. We've come up with an innovative approach to how all of those things can be combined into one project. And oh, by the way, you get the seed mixtures for free. So we hope that following this presentation that you actually take some time to go to our website and look that over. We also have a Facebook page that you can get lots of updates on. If you are a Facebook user, please go and check out Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund Facebook page. We provide lots of interesting updates on there on a weekly basis, and we would love to chat with you some more. That concludes my presentation today. So this is going to get turned back over to Julia right now to consider your questions and to take the microphone back over. This is the information for how you would contact me if you want to reach out to me after this webinar. And I thank you very much for your time and attention today.
All right, thanks so much, Pete. We do have time for Q&A, so we're going to accept questions from the audience at this time. We are going to give attendees 1 minute to submit your questions. Please enter the questions into the question box on your screen, and we'll be back on to answer those questions in 1 minute. Okay, so we're going to get started with the Q&A. The first question we have, Pete, is we have pasture land. I know milkweed is not desired for livestock. Is there a way to encourage pollinators without the milkweed? Are the percentages labeled on the free seed mixtures you mentioned?
Great question. So number one, milkweed is an incredibly valuable pollinator plant for a lot of different species. Obviously, it is a host plant for monarch butterfly reproduction. The first thing I would say is that regarding its toxicity to livestock, I think that that is something that is a little bit overplayed and is a little bit of a higher concern than it really needs to be. The amount of milkweed that would have to be consumed by an animal to show reactions to that is incredibly high. So that's number one. But number two, to answer your question, yes, the actual seeding rates and amount of each species in a seeding mix is included, and you can see that on our website. For every state, it will show the honeybee mix and the monarch butterfly mix, and you can go in there and you can kind of evaluate and review those seed mixtures.
Okay, next question is, what about climate change and the longer summers for bees?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question that probably would require another 1 hour webinar. I'm going to answer the question this way. At the start of the presentation, I showed 5 different factors that are influencing pollinator populations: weather, pesticides, pathogen, disease, habitat, and pesticides. And I talked about things that we can't control. Weather was one of those that we really have a hard time controlling. So I think the most important thing that we can do is focus on providing great pollinator habitat so that we can, as best we can, try to adjust and influence all those other factors.
Okay, next question is, how far do bees travel to forage from the hive?
That's another great question, and that range varies. A honeybee could travel up to 4, maybe even 5 miles. The general distance that we kind of consider to be normal for a honeybee is 2 to 2.5 miles. But think about this. If a honeybee has to travel 3 miles to get to the forage that it's found, and it wants its sister bees to come and work to grab pollen and nectar from, and you compare that to the ability to find those same things within 300 yards, the hive will produce more honey, will have less stress, will have fewer environmental factors that it has to deal with when that forage resource is located right next to the hive. So a honeybee can travel great distances, but we don't want them to if we don't have to. That's why we want to have high quality forage right there associated with the honeybee hive.
Next question is, what states qualify for the seeding program?
Sure, it's 12 states. And the first thing I'll say, because I'm going to say some states that people are like, how come we're not in it? The first thing I'm going to say is this program is growing and expanding every year in a really well thought out growth plan. So if we're not in your state yet, we know that we need to be, and we're coming. And this program has grown from 2 states to 6 states to 11 states to 12 states in 4 years. So we're growing. But the states run from North Dakota down to Kansas and then east to Ohio, and those 12 states. And those states were picked for 2 primary reasons. One, their critical importance to honeybee health, and 2, their critical importance to monarch butterfly population recovery. So if you're not in one of those states, get in touch with us through our website and talk to us about it, because we might be able to find a way to add your state sooner.
Next question is, how do we prepare a hive for fumigation of nearby crops?
That's another great question and another topic that that could take another hour presentation. The most important thing here is communication between agriculture and the beekeeper. There's a couple of things that can be done. Number one, as a beekeeper, my hives are all registered through a program called Drift Watch, so that any chemical applicator can go to that site and know where my honeybee hives are, so they can consider that. But I opened this by talking about communication. If a beekeeper knows when, where, and what will be sprayed on an adjoining agricultural crop, they can plan for it. And the other thing is that if we're talking about pesticides, many of those pesticides can be applied at a time of the day, very early in the morning, very late in the day, or in the evening, and those are times when honeybees are not as active. So just by communicating and talking, beekeeping and agriculture, just as they always have, can work together hand in glove to minimize the impacts on honeybees.
Next question is, when considering bee and butterfly planting, is consideration given to flowering times of the year? When does foraging begin and when does it end during the growing season?
Sure. So now another great question, and I'm going to expand my answer beyond honeybees to all pollinating insects, native bees, honeybees, and butterflies. And we want to strive to have floral resources from the beginning of the growing season to the end of the growing season. And without question, the most challenging time period to provide that is in the start of the growing season. The next hardest would be the end of the growing season, like this time of the year. And the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund seed mixtures are designed to consider all those factors. Here's an example. In our monarch butterfly mix, there is a minimum of 40 wildflower species in each mix. Could be as many as 70 species, but the minimum is 40. And the reason that we do that is so that we're ensuring that we have adequate floral resources throughout the entire growing season. Because if we're only providing floral resources during kind of like June and July, we're not providing all the needs that those pollinator species need to thrive and be successful.
Okay, and the next question is, you mentioned several vegetable crops where fruits are not important. Did you mean that pollinators are needed for the seed production?
If I said during the presentation that they were not important, I said the exact opposite of what I meant, which could have happened. So let me clarify that. When we showed the table of the different crops and their dependence upon honeybee pollination, I listed off about 8 species that were 100% dependent upon honeybee pollination. And that would be to produce a crop. And Julie, if you have the opportunity, if you could just give me the controls and put it back into slide mode, I would, while I'm answering the next question, I'll go to that slide so that the person that asked that question we can all look at that table again, because it's just really important to take a look at how those crops are dependent upon honeybees.
Okay.
So if you could put me back into the slide viewer mode.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Thank Thank you, Julia. And I will find that slide. It's coming up here somewhere. So here we go. So if I said that, what I said was the exact opposite of what I meant. So if we look at this image, almonds, avocados, blueberries, broccoli, carrots, cauliflower, celery, and onions I mentioned because they are 100% on honeybees for the pollination of those fruits and vegetables.
Okay, next question is, are there programs available to establish habitat to keep bees in cold region year-round so that seasonal hives are not needed?
Give me that question once more, Julie. It's complicated.
Sure.
I want to think about it a little bit here.
Are there programs available to establish habitat to keep bees in cold regions year-round so that seasonal hives are not needed?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. I'm going to interpret it as, are there programs that will keep bees in the colder regions? Absolutely. The Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund program that I talked about will do that. Those honeybees can be treated through the cold winter months just like they always traditionally were before honeybees were moved around the country in a migratory fashion for pollination services. And traditionally, honeybees remain alive in the hive throughout the winter. We leave 200 pounds of honey for them to consume to make it through the winter to produce enough energy to generate enough heat in the hive to make it through the winter. So the answer is yes, there are lots of programs like that.
Okay, next question is, how would I get a farmer introduced to the program? What is an ideal site to be able to identify?
Sure. So an ideal site for a successful pollinator planting is one that is fully prepared and ready to be a success. Because when we talk about pollinator habitat, every person, when you say pollinator habitat, has this vision of the photo that's on the calendar in their office when you flip to the month of July, and it shows this gorgeous flowering meadow. That's what people think of when they think of pollinator habitat. And we can get there, but the way that we get there is by making sure that the site is fully prepared and ready. I'm going to try to move to one of our slides that maybe shows what some of that habitat might look like. But I think that the conversation with agriculture can happen when we have a conversation where we are working with them to identify areas of the farm and ranch in which pollinator habitat can fulfill one of the resource needs on the farm. One of the ways that it can work is perhaps it works in an area where the viable income that's coming off of that piece of land is not as high due to slopes, soil type, erosion, that sort of thing. Or we're trying to keep farm chemicals from entering the water system, as PARM talked about at the start of this webinar today. That's where pollinator habitat can play a really significant role.
Okay, next question is, your presentation sounded like honeybees need a certain type of pollinator habitat. How can I provide pollinator habitat that benefits both native bees and honeybees?
Yeah, another great question. And at the end of this presentation, I talked about the strategy that the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund uses. And that's where we take one project and we divide it into two halves and we plant two different seed mixtures. And that has been a technique that research has shown that we're providing significantly increased pollinator value for. Half of the mixture designed and planted to benefit honeybees, and half of the mixture designed and planted to benefit native bees and butterflies. And again, those pollinator species use and benefit from both sides, but because of how we design and how we establish that seed mixture, we're getting a lot of value and providing benefit to the widest possible range of pollinator species by doing that. Julia, if you could bring me back to the slide sorter on your screen again, one more time, thank you. I will, I'm gonna go down to the slide in which I kind of talked about that, and then we'll just leave this in slide sorter so I can continue to do this for other questions as well. But this image right here kind of talks about how we take every project that we work on and divide it into two halves. And this, the research projects have shown significant pollinator value by doing that.
Okay, and the last question we'll do is, if someone was interested in getting involved in beekeeping, how would you suggest they go about it?
Great question. When I was a lot younger than today, I was interested in getting into beekeeping, and back then beekeeping was really simple. You got bees, you checked on them, you made sure they were healthy. At the end of the year, you took the excess honey from the hive, you extracted it, you put it into jars, and you consumed it or you sold it. And that honeybee was very likely healthy and happy and made it through the winter. Those days are gone. So if somebody has an interest in getting into beekeeping, the number one tip that I can give you is to find a mentor. Somebody that is a well-established beekeeper that's been doing it for a while, that will take you under their wing for a year or maybe even 2 years, attend a beekeeping class, and go into this to learn how it is much more complicated now. You have to treat your bees. You have to supplemental feed your bees. You have to, it's a lot more labor intensive to keep a honeybee colony healthy and surviving when we have 35 to 45% annual losses. Julia, just a comment, that great set of questions that came at the end of it. I really appreciate the level of interest that folks had with the questions that they asked.
All right, great. So yep, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A at this time. I want to thank you again, Pete, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Absolutely, it was a joy.
Great. Okay, at this time, I want to recognize our premier egg retailer members, the Andersons, a gold member, and silver members, Gertie Egg and Nutrient Egg Solutions. Their contributions helped make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that egg retailers are making to reduce nutrient impairments. For more information on membership, contact our project manager at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website and click Become a Member to fill out our online form. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge additional funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible, in particular the McKnight Foundation and the Great Lakes Protection Fund. If you are interested in sponsoring future webinars, please contact me at julia@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with the webinar evaluation and a webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you are watching the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date do you need to email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. One last reminder to please take the webinar evaluation. The link to the survey is provided on this slide and will also be emailed to all registrants in a few days. This survey is a great way to let us know what topics you want to hear about on future webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar in November.